So we're going to go from storytelling to deep, deep geek. This is going to be super tactical. There's not going to be any story here, so apologies in advance. Well, we can start with a little bit of a story. I first came to MozCon in 2012 as an attendee, and honestly, I didn't tell anybody this, but it was my dream that I never thought would happen, that I'd actually be a featured speaker on the MozCon stage. Yeah, the community speaking thing was awesome. I never thought I'd come back. So I'm here to tell you today that Google Tag Manager will literally make your dreams come true. We're going to be covering a lot in a really short amount of time. I did the math on it, and I have about 68 seconds to cover each tip, and you could easily spend an hour talking about any given tip here. So you're going to want to access this full write-up that we put together with tools and resources at upbuild.io/GTM. You can reference that, and each slide is going to have a link to the specific tip on it. I want to get on the same page before we get started with what exactly I'm going to cover in this talk. Probably goes without saying that I'm going to cover 29 ways for you to level up your Google Tag Manager usage. I'm going to show you advanced analytics applications. We're going to talk about conversion rate optimization, website personalization, and even good old-fashioned SEO. I'm really excited about that stuff. I'm also going to prove that Google Tag Manager is the best tool for your money. I mean, it's hard to beat free, right? So unless you have like $100,000 laying around and you could purchase an enterprise-level tag management tool, Google Tag Manager is going to be the way to go. And I think it's a great strong point for the tool because there's no barrier to entry. If you want to mess around for a month just getting your feet wet and seeing if it's something that's going to work for you, you're not burning money the whole time. But if you do have one of those enterprise-level tag management tools, the good thing is these concepts can apply to any tag management platform. I'm also going to give you resources to deepen your expertise. Unless you have a strong background in front-end web development, you're just not going to be able to become a fully fledged expert in GTM in a day, let alone a month. So I'm going to leave you with stuff where you can continue to learn a little bit more about JavaScript, a little bit more about the platform, and of course, give you full details about all the tips. And finally, I'm going to open your mind to new possibilities. And I know that sounds incredibly cheesy, so let me explain. I loved watching the movie The Martian. And I don't know if this was a common reaction, but when I was in the crowd, I kept thinking the whole time, this is exactly the way I use Google Tag Manager. It validated my entire process for approaching tag management and using it as a tool for SEO, which is not what it's packaged for. When Mark Watney is on the surface of Mars, GTM, or the HAB, was his GTM. What he did was pulled apart the whole thing, took all those pieces, reconfigured them in unexpected ways, and figured out how to solve his problems with the tools that are available to him. GTM allows you to do that. Pull apart your whole website, pull apart JavaScript, and come up with cool, creative ways based on the challenges that you're dealing with. And come up with stuff that other people might not even be motivated to find, and you're going to be one step ahead of the game. So let's also talk about what I'm not going to do in this talk really quickly. I'm not going to review any of the basic mechanics and installation process for Google Tag Manager. There's just not enough time. We could spend an entire day on that. So I'm just going to have to assume a basic level of familiarity. I'm also not going to be able to give you the click-by-click. Again, 68 seconds per tip. So go to upbuild.io/GTM if you need documentation there. I'm also not going to teach you how to code. So sorry, Will Reynolds. But that's OK. I read that Will and Rand are committing to learn how to code in 2017. I mean, I read it on Twitter. That makes it a real thing. So they're on the hook now. And one last thing. I'm not going to drop a knowledge bomb today and then leave you hanging. If you have any questions on GTM, you want to talk about any of the tips, or you just want to chat me up, I'm going to be around for the rest of MozCon. Come find me. I'll be happy to help as much as I can. And it's important to note that these tips aren't just for analytics nerds. They're for anyone who's up to the task of doing marketing better. You could be the one-person marketing army in your organization who's tasked with literally everything. You might be the savvy enterprise marketer who is leading a team and is intensely driven to get amazing results. You could be the efficient idealist who wants to collect the right data in the most efficient way possible with minimal process overhead. Or you could be the under-the-radar innovator who is going to ask for forgiveness later rather than permission, is going to hack their way to results if they need to. Google Tag Manager is just going to be an incredibly powerful tool, and the more time you spend in it, the more you start to see how you can bend and even break the rules to serve your purposes and accomplish your goals. So without further ado, let's get into some GTM tips. I know I talked about not doing housekeeping, and this is a quick overview of what these slides are going to look like. But the first tip is going to talk about housekeeping. Before you get into Google Tag Manager stuff, you want to make sure that you actually have it installed properly. There's nothing worse than rolling out really cool stuff with GTM to figure out months down the line that like you had an entire directory where Google Tag Manager wasn't installed properly. So using Screaming Frog, you can set up custom filters to grab GTM IDs off the page. You can also set up custom extractions so you can grab any unknown IDs and see if you're coming in blind to a new account, for example, you're going to know how many containers are on the site if there's conflicting tags and stuff like that. A lot of the stuff that we're going to do is going to involve using jQuery to simplify what we're tagging in Google Tag Manager. Now, if jQuery is not a familiar term for you, that makes it even more important. jQuery is a way of simplifying JavaScript. It's a library you can load onto your site so you can access click handlers, things that are going to track how people are interacting with your site. It makes it much, much easier for you. About 70% of sites on the web already use jQuery, so the chances of you needing this on a regular basis aren't that great. But in case you run into a site where you don't have it or you might not have it, you can have a workflow, and this is admittedly a little hacky, to have a tag that's going to fire in Google Tag Manager, and it's going to check for jQuery on every page. If jQuery has been loaded, it doesn't do anything. If it hasn't been loaded, it will actually go and retroactively add jQuery to your code and then make it so that you can use all these shortcuts to do your tagging from that point forward. So we talk a lot about, in the analytics space, getting clickstream data and understanding how people are navigating through your site. Out of the box, of course, we can see page views, but we want to be able to see clicks as well. How are people using the navigation on our site? Are they clicking on our CTAs? Are they filling out forms? Using Google Tag Manager, you can actually do this really efficiently, and it's pretty awesome. So at Upbuild, the way we do analytics is we have 2 tags that handle all of the clickstream tracking for our entire operation. One tag is actually going to start by applying click handlers to anything we want to track. So let's say we want to track every navigation element and see which links in the navigation are getting more clicked, so we can decide whether we want to reprioritize things, if we want to make things, take things out because people aren't clicking on them to begin with. We can track all that stuff by applying click handlers to those with jQuery. And then we have a second tag that actually just receives data. So there's this giant tag that's going to track all the little elements on our site that we want to pay attention to, and then a second tag that actually receives that data and pushes it into Google Analytics for us. Makes it much more efficient, and this is what the tag looks like. It's pretty, it's gonna make your eyes bleed to try to look at it right now, but once you understand the basic template, it's very easy to go through your whole site and set this up. And so here's the process. There's a great Chrome extension called jQuery Unique Selector, so even if you don't know jQuery, you can just click on an element, it's going to give you this piece of code that you can use to attach click tracking to anything on your site. This is something that I think is awesome about GTM. You can build out your entire Google Tag Manager container without having to have any code on your website. You can start experimenting, test something, totally fail, go back to the drawing board, keep incrementally improving things, and then finally arrive at your perfected version without ever having to put out something that you're not super confident about on a client site, for example, or on your site. The way this works is that you can enter preview mode in Google Tag Manager, and it gives you access to this awesome debugging panel where you can see all the tags that are firing, all the data that's being collected, and QA that stuff really thoroughly before you have to have anything actually send into Google Analytics. And the cool thing is you can use another Chrome extension called GTM Injector to spoof having the GTM base code on a site. So if I wanted to get Moz as a client, for example, I could test and build out an entire Google Tag Manager container without them having to do anything. And then as soon as they put that code on the site, they're good to go. I just hit publish and we're done. Google has been making a big push to get Google Tag Manager into the enterprise game lately, and environments are a big piece of that. So if you have a multi-tiered development environment, like you have a dev site, you have a staging site, you have a production site, you can configure Google Tag Manager so that it recognizes all of those, and then you can selectively push your code out to the different environments to have your whole team be able to QA things and test. Now there's even an additional feature called Workspaces that they rolled out just under 2 weeks ago that makes it really easy to collaborate. So if you hop into your Tag Manager account and you start making changes, it automatically creates a new workspace for you to do all your work in. Then if for some reason, like you're doing a 3-day project in GTM, you're sick one of those days, and somebody has to jump into Tag Manager and make a change because it's a critical tracking need. When you get back, GTM is going to notify you and say, hey, changes have been made to the container. how do you want to manage these conflicts? And you can choose to merge, you can choose to overwrite. It keeps things a lot cleaner, so you can have a whole team in GTM now and work together with perfect harmony. So we've been talking a lot about conversion rate optimization this MozCon. So what happens when you run a great A/B test in something like Optimizely, and you reach statistical significance for one of your variations, and you need to make that change to your site because it's a 20% lift in conversions? Why wouldn't you want all visitors to see that? One option is, of course, to direct 100% of your traffic into that Optimizely variation, for example, but unless you're on an enterprise plan with Optimizely, you're paying by monthly unique visits. So you're kind of burning money if you're sending 100% of your traffic to that just because you can't get your development team to implement the change permanently. What you can do, and again, this is kind of hacky, is copy your variation code from Optimizely, just open that up in the Optimizely editor, copy, paste that into Google Tag Manager, and that's gonna do the exact same thing, except it's gonna be free and sustainable, and until you can actually get that physically implemented on your site the proper way, it's gonna get you by. Now, seasoned analytics specialists are gonna realize, of course, that out of the box, Google Analytics only tracks page views. If you go to something like a PDF file or an MP3 file, Google Analytics doesn't collect any data. Google Tag Manager never loads because it's a file. It doesn't communicate with your server. That's actually a great reason why Sam mentioned the importance of server log files. That's where you're gonna get that data, but you can customize Google Analytics to grab some of that data. And what you can do within Google Tag Manager is turn on this built-in variable called click URL, and then anytime someone clicks a link on the site, you're going to be able to access what that URL was. So you can selectively start tracking any URL that's clicked that ends with the file extension that you care about. So whether that's PDF, CSV, PPT, all that kind of stuff, you can track that in Google Tag Manager using really simple functionality that's already pretty much built in. Same thing with downloads that happen from offsite sources. So say you have a sales team that's sending like spec sheets or about PDFs, white papers to prospective clients. You want to be able to see if people are actually downloading that information, and you're not going to be able to see that because it has no relation to your website, even if it's hosted on your server. But what you can do with GTM is set up a kind of pseudo intermediary download page, just a blank page that says like, hey, please be patient while we're preparing your download. It's going to flash for like a quick second. But what you can do in that quick half second is tag that information, send it to Google Analytics, and actually implement a redirect in Google Tag Manager to carry them forward to the asset that they requested. So you just have the asset specified in your query string, have your sales team use that rather than just the raw link to like a PDF, for example. GTM's gonna recognize which asset they want, log that data in GA, and then redirect them to their final destination. Outbound clicks on your site, very similarly, you want to be able to see not only when people are coming into your site, but when people are going out. Now, I've seen people track this kind of going a little overboard in Google Analytics, where you get the full URL for every single outbound link tracked within your reports, and you have this massive report of like 20,000 links. And it's not really that actionable. It doesn't tell you a lot about user behavior. But what you would love to be able to see is like what sites in general are people most attracted to. So you want to see how many people left our site to go to Moz, how many people left our site to go to Wikipedia, how many people went to a page on Google's Help Center. So what you can do is configure another auto event variable to grab the host name whenever somebody clicks a link. And if that host name, basically the domain name, if it doesn't match the site they're currently on, meaning it's not your site, you send that to Google Analytics, classified as an external click. Now this is something that can get a little confusing, and we see the terms cross-domain tracking confused with subdomain tracking pretty frequently. But they're very different, and there's different applications for both. Subdomain tracking, it should probably go without saying, is when you have different subdomains that you have users navigating back and forth between. dev.moz.com doesn't actually exist, just for purposes of illustration, so don't try to go there, there's nothing there. So if they have the dev site and the Moz site, you want to be able to track people going back and forth. The way that cookies are set with GTM is a little problematic because it starts from the left-hand side and things don't really match up. So you can actually do a quick setting change within Google Tag Manager and set what's called cookie domain to auto. Not the most intuitive thing, but what it does essentially is just flips the order and starts applying the cookie from the right-hand side, and it sets it in the same place so everything communicates properly and everything is sunshine and rainbows. Cross-domain tracking is something that you want to choose carefully. The only reason you'll really want to do this is if you have multiple domain names that are all part of the same user journey. So the most common application is if somebody has to go to a third-party site to check out on your e-commerce site, like Shopify is a common one, you'll want to set up cross-domain tracking. You can do that by setting allow linker to true in your Google Tag Manager settings, put in the domains that you want to link in these cross-domain settings, so a comma-separated list of all the domains that you want to appear as one unified user experience. And then you have to hop into Google Analytics and set up that referral exclusion list. You need to do all 3 steps or it won't work. It's very common to leave one of those out. So we talked about subdomains. So if you have subdomains, you want to be able to see the full host name printed in your GA reports. You don't want to have, moz.com/about, and then let's say there's an about page on the dev site, dev.moz.com/about. By default, you're just going to see a big lump of traffic under /about when you look at your Google Analytics reports. So what you can do is print the full host name. So you'll actually see www.moz.com/about and dev.moz.com/about. See that unique traffic broken out properly. And basically all you have to do is overwrite the page path when you're sending data into Google Analytics via Google Tag Manager. Stripping out personally identifiable information is pretty important and not something that you necessarily think of. So personally identifiable information is something that you are forbidden, according to Google's terms of service, from sending to their servers for any reason. So this is a legally sensitive topic, so it's important to remember, not a lawyer, but there is a big risk. If you're caught for any reason by Google sending things like email addresses, credit card numbers into your Google Analytics account, they are going to, potentially, if they catch that, wipe out your entire GA profile, not just the specific kind of view that is contained within the profile. They're going to take out the whole thing. Even if you have unrelated sites in there, they're just going to wipe it all out because it's a violation of their TOS. So really, really be careful. And it's not enough to apply Google Analytics filters because that happens after the fact. The data's already been sent to Google. So Google Tag Manager, everything that it does happens before any data is sent out for processing. So you can use GTM to intercept that. Without getting into this, it's pretty complicated code. You'll be able to access what the script looks like. Is creating a JavaScript variable that's going to receive any query string parameters. It's going to check for sensitive information like emails or credit card numbers. It's going to leave any non-PII information intact and replace that personally identifiable information with a warning message. This is a little bit what it looks like. It's actually based on a post by a guy named Simo Ahava. He's kind of like the godfather of Google Tag Manager. He's awesome. So I've kind of modified his script, which originally only looked for email addresses, to also look for credit card numbers. So you set this up, you're always protected because it's always going to recognize that if it's being passed in, and it's going to give you a message if it ever is found. And then at that point, it's up to you to pull out your detective magnifying glass and figure out why you're getting PII in the first place. So yo, dog, we heard you like variables, so put variables in your variables. You've seen this in a couple examples, whether or not you realized it, but Google Tag Manager has this awesome ability to be able to combine variables to form other variables, or to form different tags based on other variables that you set up. Sounds pretty complicated. I had a good example here, which I actually don't like anymore because there was a better example published on UMoz. It was actually a post about setting your canonical tags using Google Tag Manager and grabbing the HTTP protocol as a variable, grabbing the host name as a variable, and grabbing the page extension as a variable, and using that to form one mega variable that's composed of 3 for the canonical tag, and then using GTM to output that onto your site. That was pretty cool. There's a link to that in the notes, by the way. If you work in B2B marketing or any kind of lead gen, you know the importance of paying attention to both Google Analytics data and CRM data. It's actually pretty easy to join these 2 data sets using Google Tag Manager. What it really relies on is finding a unique key that both data sets share so that you can merge them together. Now, every CRM system is going to have a unique ID for any recognized user. So if somebody fills out a form or they register for a webinar, Pardot, Marketo, Eloqua, HubSpot, they're all going to set a unique ID for that user in the user's browser. GTM has built-in variables that can grab any cookie for you really easily, so you just find out what the name of that cookie is, Then you pass it into Google Analytics with all the rest of your data every time that cookie is picked up. And then at regular intervals, export your data from the CRM along with that unique ID, and then have their lead status next to that, have their lead value next to that, and then you can upload that using the Universal Analytics import functionality and see that data within your Google Analytics reports. It's really cool. You could even get more complicated and try to automate the whole thing, but really cool possibilities there. And Mike over at Portent wrote a great post on that, so definitely check that out, and that's in the notes as well. So this is something I kind of like recreationally enjoy watching debates about. People love to argue about what a data layer is, how it fits into web technology at all. So I'll kind of just talk about it in the context of Google Tag Manager. So anything that we interact with, that our users interact with on our site, is what's known as the experience layer. It's all the front-end code, it's what people click on, it's what people convert on. The application layer is what powers that. It's the database, it's the server, and that's what makes the experience layer possible. But what if there's information that you want to track in Google Analytics, because that top layer is where 99% of the stuff within GA happens. That's actually why Samuel, the community speaker, was talking about, like, server logs are the only true accurate source of getting your 100% accurate traffic, because if something goes wrong at the experience layer, if somebody's not using JavaScript, if information isn't printed correctly, that visitor is not going to get picked up, but the server layer is accessing that from the application layer. So what if there's something like the logged in state of a user? You want to know how many people on your site are visiting who are actually people who are logging in. You can print that information to the data layer, which is an intermediary kind of layer in between, and Google Tag Manager has functionality to be able to grab that grab that variable out of the data layer without having it, without necessitating that it goes to the experience layer, and then you can put that into Google Analytics as well. So we talk a lot about content at MozCon, and I think we know by now that creating content for the sake of content is completely worthless. You need to create content that helps people. You need to create content that tells a story. You need to create content that engages, that isn't going to get people to go right back to the search results. That's not going to help your perceived quality for your site. So let's talk about ways to measure that. Tips 16, 17, and 18 are going to give you different ways to measure engagement on your content. So measuring scroll depth is one that we can start with. So we want to see how far people scroll down our long landing pages. If you have a 16,000-word blog post, you want to see if people are actually spending time on that and getting all the way to the bottom. There's a great plugin at Parsnip that you can use, free to use and easy to put into your site via Google Tag Manager. Now 17 gets a little more advanced, and I think it provides more meaningful data. You can observe dwell time, meaning how long are people spending on a page, and then fire off an event after a user has been there a specified amount of time. The issue with Google Analytics, for better or worse, is that these metrics like bounce rate and time on site are calculated between successive hits. So a page view is a hit, and the second page view in a user's journey is also a hit. What happens if someone only looks at one page and they're there for 20 minutes and they love the blog post, they buffer it, and then they leave the site? Google Analytics is going to say, hey, that's 100% bounce rate, that's 0 seconds time on site, because they have no frame of reference to say, okay, where was the second point that we can calculate this math from? So with measuring dwell time, what you can do is fire an event after a specific amount of time to negate the bounce rate, show that was actually a sticky visit, and actually get an accurate time on site. So you can do something like, say, a flat 20 seconds, and say any page all over the site, if somebody stays on 20 seconds, we're going to say that's good. Or you can get more complicated and use JavaScript to count the number of words on the page, divide that by some number you're comfortable with, find what feels like a good range, divide it by 10, divide it by 15, divide it by 20, and then convert that to milliseconds, and then use JavaScript's set timeout method to fire off an event to GA once they're on a page for the specified amount of time. So on a home page, maybe you want them there for 20 seconds before you're considering them a sticky visitor. On a blog post, that's going to be more like 2 minutes because it's much, much longer based on word count. Now, monitoring pogo sticking is a really cool idea. It's probably the most experimental thing in here. So take this recommendation with a grain of salt. And just as a note, this is 100% not my idea. This guy that I mentioned previously, Simo, he came up with this idea to, okay, let's figure out how we can monitor how many people are coming from Google search results to our site then calculate how long it takes for them to bounce back to the organic search results so we can monitor that and make sure that's not going to impact our rankings in a negative way. So when somebody comes in from Google, you can actually use Google Tag Manager to log a new browser history entry. You're kind of faking a new browser history state with GTM. Then if somebody clicks on the back button, it's going to try to convert that browser history event to a blank string. Google Tag Manager out of the box can pick up on that, and you can say, okay, now let's actually fire a tag into GA with how many seconds they spent on the site, say they were someone who bounced back to the search results, and then manually invoke the previous browser state to send them back. So there's a lot that can go wrong here. You're creating fake browser history entries. You're intercepting a user's request before you actually send them on their way. So again, take this with a grain of salt, and if you're going to do it, experiment and test, and then experiment and test again. Make sure it's going to work on your site configuration. But pretty cool opportunity nonetheless. Of course, if you're working in GA and you're paying attention to that, and that's how you're calculating your success, you want to make sure the data is not getting muddied by your own team's traffic. So the traditional way to do this is filtering out IPs within Google Analytics. That, however, does not take into account people who maybe are working from home, if your entire team is distributed, if you have people traveling, and if your office doesn't have static IP addresses. It's nearly impossible to maintain this with any sense of reliability. So what you can do on top of IP filtering is define a parameter that's going to indicate someone's on our team and we don't want them in our Google Analytics account. You always want to have an unfiltered profile that always collect any data regardless of where it comes from, but you can set up a filtered view that's going to say this is not including people from our internal team, and you can set that up with GTM so that's listening for that parameter, and you send this link to everyone in your organization. So say you send an email and you instruct folks to open this on every browser they do work from, on every device, and then those are all going to be tagged to be excluded from your Google Analytics. Now this is some really cool stuff. Updating metadata. You can actually update the metadata and other content assets on your site for SEO purposes using Google Tag Manager. This is crazy that this kind of happens a lot, but I've seen it so many times throughout my career. Is you write some really cool metadata for the site. You're like, okay, we've tested this in PPC. We know it's going to lead to an increased click-through rate. And then the client's like, well, okay, well, we can't get that implemented until next month. Or we have a homegrown site that doesn't have a CMS, and we need to hire a developer to be able to make that change. And you're like, really? So what you can do is hack it together and get by with Google Tag Manager. You can actually inject a tag into the site that's going to identify what element you want to change and then override it. This page on Upbuild, the page title is just Analytics. Using Google Tag Manager, we've actually injected a script onto the page, overwritten the page title, and Google, within 2 weeks, actually crawled it, executed the code, and is returning that in their search results. I've seen people do this on larger scales as well, but it's worth noting that if your site has a lot of JavaScript complexity, like it's a Node.js app or an Angular app, Google's probably going to give up executing JavaScript after a while. So if you have a lot of stuff going on, your mileage may vary. But if your site is relatively simple, like 99% of WordPress sites, you're probably going to be able to do this. So cool thing to start pushing the limit on and see how far you can get with it. Another cool one, everyone who knows me knows I'm a geek about structured data. So back at SearchFest earlier this year, I spoke about this idea of using Google Tag Manager to dynamically push out JSON LD markup so we can be eligible for things like blog post markup, recipe rich cards, all kinds of cool stuff along the lines of products. But when I spoke about it originally, it was kind of theoretical, and I didn't really have the JavaScript know-how to figure it out. But luckily, this guy, Chris Goddard, who works at serps.com, he's a much better coder than me, and he figured it out. And he posted it on the Moz blog a couple months ago. There's a link to that in the notes. And so a client came to us and said, hey, we have a recipe site. We have thousands of recipes. We add new recipes every day, and we want to be eligible for Google's new recipe rich cards on mobile. If you guys have heard about that, it's really cool. It's designed to make the mobile experience easier, but it relies on structured data in JSON LD. So how could we scale this out without having to require that client to loop in a bunch of additional dev resources to actually change their content management system? We could use GTM to do it. The process involved taking that JSON LD template, stripping it down to its bare skeleton, so it's just this kind of rough container, and then within Google Tag Manager, you create a new variable to pull in each relevant data point, and then use that to populate that JSON LD shell. And so we pushed that out with Google Tag Manager across 1,500 pages, and awesomely enough, that validated in the structured data testing tool. It showed up in the Search Console reports, and most importantly, it actually led to generating recipe-rich cards in the mobile search results. So a quick one, if you don't have the standard version of internal site search tracking, you want to be able to see what people are searching for in your internal search results. So you can actually hack this together and say, if you don't have question mark search term equals XYZ, but you have some different format, you can actually reconfigure your query strings or your URLs, for that matter, within Google Tag Manager and put them into the expected format. The really cool thing, there's a blog post on it that gets more into detail. I don't want to spend a ton of time on it right now, but check that out. Now, I wish there was a one-size-fits-all solution for this. So it's becoming more and more common that we have these dynamic web apps that don't really behave in the expected way that Google Tag Manager out of the box is going to be able to track. So if you have like an Angular app that users can navigate through and the URLs don't necessarily change, like Will Reynolds yesterday showed that example from Callaway Golf, where there's this golf club finder, and you want to know how far people are getting into that, but URLs don't change, events aren't firing off in the expected way, you can't actually use your traditional methods there. So you have to kind of figure out whether you're going to use advanced listening, whether you want to ask your developers very nicely to include a data layer in there so you can get that information. But really, you just have to experiment and get more and more familiar with Google Tag Manager so you can kind of take those things as they come. Now, fortunately, if you are on Angular, there's a great new project in GitHub that will allow you to seamlessly integrate Google Tag Manager functionality into your Angular app. I personally haven't used this yet, but the people behind it are wicked smart, so check it out. Now, measuring video engagement, of course, like if we're going to create video content, we don't want to just put it on the site and be like, okay, we created video, good, we're awesome. We need to see how many people are watching it. When people watch the video, are they more inclined to actually convert for us? We want to know if that video is paying off. If you're using embedded YouTube videos on your site, you can actually use a plugin that was created by Cardinal Path that leverages the YouTube API to track video progress at predefined points, 25% increments. Pretty cool stuff. Or, you know what, if you don't want to hack it together, just use Wistia like an adult. I'm not being paid to say that, but I love Wistia, and their analytics integration is off the hook. You don't have to do anything, and you can have data start coming into your analytics immediately without having to set any settings. So it makes your job a whole lot easier. Now, Kara, on day one, mentioned looking in Google Analytics to see where people were abandoning forms to ideate hypotheses for your CRO testing. The complication is that's not a default thing that you have in your Google Analytics account. You need to set that up. So using Google Tag Manager, what you can do is as people start editing progressively more and more form fields in a form, so say this is like 6 form fields long, we're going to progressively add information into a JavaScript array and say, okay, when they edit the first field, they got to name. By the time they get to the third field, they've got to name, they've got to email, they've got to organization. If they abandon the form, we have a rule that says, okay, then send that data into GA so we can see a full report of where people are abandoning forms and where we need to possibly improve with CRO testing. If your site is ad supported, you're relying on that revenue, you really want to understand how many people are blocking ads on your site. So this is another thing you can kind of hack together. There's no really good way to do it. And especially if an ad blocker is blanket blocking any request to google.com because they're serving so many ads, it's not going to load GA. It's not going to load GTM either. So there's a certain percentage you're just never going to be able to track unless you're using your server log files. But you can get an approximation of how many people are visiting your site with ad blockers by actually using GTM to load up basically bait for these ad blockers. So you create a script that's something super obvious, ads.js or advertisement.js. And that does one simple thing. It sets a global variable on your site. So using GTM, you can see if that has been set. If it has been set successfully, you know that there was no ad blocker there. If it wasn't, you actually return true and send that information into Google Analytics. So after that, you'll be able to start seeing reports and say what percentage of our users are using ad blockers. That's going to be very important if that's something you rely on. So there are great personalization tools out there that you can pay for that are going to do this kind of the proper way. But if you need a proof of concept or you just are really limited on budget, you can hack together personalization using Google Tag Manager. So all of us likely have some kind of funnel on our site For example, one of the clients Upbuild works with gets donations to fund research that they're doing in the medical space. So we want to see how many people we can get to actually make a donation. So using GTM, we can set a cookie whenever somebody enters the funnel. We know they have intent. They're considering making a donation. So we set a cookie that says entered funnel. We let them progress through, and then on the final page, on the donation successful page, we actually remove the cookie. So who has that cookie still at the end of the day? It's the people who entered the funnel but didn't yet convert. So we can actually use that to fire additional HTML tags on our homepage to say, if someone has that entered funnel cookie, it means they didn't convert, but they're probably going to be more predisposed to actually finishing what they started. So we can show different content to them using Google Tag Manager based on that cookie. Now, this is not something that I came up with at all. It's just a post that I saw like a couple weeks ago, and I was like, this is so cool, I need to include it in my deck, 100%. It's by a guy named Stephen Harris over at Seer. If you don't know what a lookup table is, it's just a fancy JavaScript variable in Google Tag Manager that passes in one variable and then outputs something else based on what that is. So for example, if you have a bunch of domains that you want to track in Google Analytics, and you have site 1 and site 2 are supposed to send their information to one Google Analytics property. The dev site has their own, depending on whether they're on domain 2, domain 3, or domain 5. They send to a specific one. So you have all this complication. And those can be really hard to maintain. They can be very time-consuming to build out if you have hundreds of rows there. So Stephen's solution allows you to not only scale that very efficiently, but actually use regular expression matching in there as well, which is really, really cool. So you can take something like this and condense it down to this using his method. So check that out. It's worth reading for sure. And the way that that one works is it actually uses Google Sheets to help you generate that lookup table, and then creates an exported Google Tag Manager container that you can import into your account and get all those variables pre-set up for you. So what I want to talk about here for tip 29 is actually further leveraging that import functionality. So to get to the heart of it, really what this boils down to is when you have a whole Google Tag Manager account and you have all of your tags set up, all of your variables set up, all your triggers set up, you can recycle that work and get yourself a huge head start on a subsequent project by exporting that full container and importing it into a new account. You can get yourself weeks ahead of the curve if you need to. So what I want to do for MozCon is make Upbuild's standard Google Tag Manager base container available to everyone here. So this contains all of the tags that we just talked about right now, plus some other stuff that we use on a daily basis. We use this to basically pre-populate all of the client work that we do. So I'm making it available to everyone. It's a new version that actually people on my team haven't even had a chance to play with yet. It's called Eru 2. So check it out. Go to that link and you can get your copy. And for the next 30 days, I only want it to be available to MozCon attendees. Don't share out the password unless you want. I'm not the boss of you, but the password is Roger. So let me take a break. Packing way too much time. I really like this movie, Kung Fury, if you guys have seen it. It's awesome. But at the end of the day, in the face of these overwhelming challenges in marketing, we just have to GTM the shit out of this. Be Mark Watney. Become a student of the Watney School of Marketing. Let the obstacles and challenges that you face shape the way you do things. Let it motivate you to figure out creative ways to accomplish your marketing goals that your competitors might not be motivated to find. And one thing I want to leave you with is that the most helpful thing you can know about Google Tag Manager is what it really is. What is Google Tag Manager? It's nothing more than a glorified JavaScript injector. So you don't have to be a coder to get the most out of Google Tag Manager, but anything you can learn a little bit more about JavaScript, whether that's 5 minutes a week that you're just learning one specific additional function about JavaScript, it's going to be very helpful. So I want to leave you with some resources here. You can download all these, of course, some tools that you can get, some blog posts that you can read that are highly recommended, old-fashioned books, you guys remember those, and courses online to teach you JavaScript. Most of these are free or freemium. And that's it. Happy optimizing. Keep moving forward and figure out creative solutions.